I'm angry at how hard life is and need to vent. I know sort of in the same boat and that life is just hard. I want to share my story. My dad was the breadwinner and the fights him and my mom had were very explosive, though mutual. My dad had a terrifying temper, literally threw me into walls as a small child and would slam me around. My mom worked days, my dad nights. I always saw him as a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type personality. The nice version of him was the sexually abusive version. When my younger sister was 3, I noticed his demeanor changed around her, and so when I went to school that day, I told my dad's secret and he was arrested. We had to stay in a woman's shelter and I lost all of my friends in an instant. It turned out my mom couldn't afford everything after that and we had to go live in my aunt's basement. My mom hated me, and it was at that moment I realized my dad had been her scapegoat all of those years and now I was the target. She would reward my sister when I got in trouble and they often ganged up on me. I had many injuries over the next few years, but because of what happened with my dad, my mom said I had PTSD and it was self-harm. I don't know how people believed that I broke my own wrist or welted the back of my own legs to the point the fabric would stick in my wounds, but whatever. Because of my mental troubles I was often heavily medicated and had frequent trips to psychiatric holds. My mom would make me take a bottle of ibuprofen, slapping me in the face till I swallowed each one, then take me to the ER, with tears in her eyes, where they would put a tube down my nose to make me drink the charcoal. My sister hated me for ruining her family, though I had to babysit her so I would get in more trouble when my mom got home. My mom regularly embarrassed me at school, and combined with the treatment plans all the kids hated me. She told the school that I had an eating disorder but really just kept the food locked up, so I wasn't allowed to use the bathroom alone at school. Finally, when I was 12, I convinced them not to send me home with her and I was put in foster care. The homes I went to also sucked. Older kids bullied me and slammed me around. After 4 homes in a year, I decided I could do better on my own. I don't regret this decision, my life improved. I was 13 when I met some older gangbangers who sold drugs and they helped me quite a bit. I worked for them, though not selling drugs or prostitution or anything. Usually I just lured men who owed them money away to wherever they wanted me to so they could collect. I also went on a couple trips where I suspect now that I was being used as a mule or whatever, but that wasn't too often. I never felt bad for the men I lured because the only reason it worked was because of the bad intentions they had for me. I got some jobs working under the table and found some private landlords to rent from, an elderly lady who took pity on me and I guess other lost kids in the past. When I was about to be 16 I got caught and they sent me to a detention center for about a year, and then I went back to another foster home. There really wasn't anything bad about this one, other than they just ignored me. I felt like I might as well be living on my own and so I left again as a runaway. I went back to rent from the elderly lady again and I found out that companies weren't allowed to do a background check if you are under 18, so I got a real job. When I was 17, the elderly lady was out of town, but this girl when I was 17, the elderly lady was out of town, but this girl 21F showed up on my doorstep with her son and a kitten, and I guess she used to stay there before. She had hoped the lady would watch her son for her, but instead left him with me, promising to be back. She didn't come back for 6 weeks and had no contact with me during that time. I didn't really know what to do and I was afraid of getting arrested myself, so I just kept him. I sent him to an at-home daycare and I worked at night and I just made it work. When I got him, he was nonverbal, but with me, I taught him how to use silverware, say his alphabet and sing songs. When she came back, I didn't feel good about handing him back over to her. She said she had did a training to be a truck driver and that was the only job she found that would work for her. She said she would leave him with me and pay me every month to keep him as long as she could crash with me for a few days whenever she was home. I agreed. Then she took me to meet her boyfriend 46M at a truck stop. He offered to show me around the truck, but as soon as I was in, he hit me in the face with a can and handcuffed me to the bed. For the next 8 weeks he raped me, videotaped it, and would just tell me crazy unhinged plans of his for the future. I was a virgin prior to this, but fell pregnant. He was happy though. He wanted to lead a cult. He said his girlfriend wasn't very maternal so I could handle the kids, she wanted more too and they would work. It was honestly easier to be compliant and friendly, so I was. I know some people will make that my fault now because I didn't fight harder. I didn't really know what to do. It's not like I had a family looking for me. During this trip, I guess she was looking for a place for us to settle. She landed in a trailer park in New Mexico. I guess she found a neighbor couple who were watching her son for her. When I got there was just a futon in the trailer and some paper plates and a single pen. I didn't get to see the little boy, but they said they would be back in about 6 weeks. They left me with $80 for food and paid the rent. I turned 18 alone except for my pregnancy. The lady next door invited me over for a party. I hit it off with a man who would later be my husband, let's call him Sean. He was 26 and didn't hit on me but was just nice. We left the party to get McDonald's and ate it at the empty trailer. I was about 3 months pregnant at this point, and we never talked about it. I told him I would probably move back to Colorado at some point. The next day he showed up at my house with groceries and said if I would cook, he would keep bringing them by. He would always get too drunk and say that he couldn't drive, but I would make him sleep on the floor every night, and every night he did without complaint. He always left more stuff each time he came. Looking back, he was probably homeless himself and just couch surfing. As we got closer to the 6 weeks when they would be coming back, I started to panic about the situation. I finally told him what happened. He encouraged me that since I was 18 now, I could probably get my warrants resolved. He let me use his phone, and I called my old caseworker who did agree to drop the warrants. I also got the courage to call the truck drivers and tell them if they came back I would report them to the police. There was some back and forth and he threatened to use the videos to make it seem consensual, but ultimately they didn't come back. The sleazy trailer park manager said he wouldn't return the deposit to me, but ultimately as long as I paid the rent, he didn't care. I applied for Medicaid and when I was 18 weeks pregnant, I got an abortion. I felt really bad doing it so late, and I also regret not finding out the gender and rushing the required ultrasound. After that, Sean agreed to move in officially and pay half the bills, in exchange for me keeping up with the other half, cooking, cleaning and doing the laundry. The thing was, he liked expensive things, like a cable package that was literally more than our rent, so I often had to work 2 jobs to keep up. I also had to walk everywhere since only he could drive. When I did save enough for a car, it was a stick and I had to teach myself to drive, although that didn't happen for about a year later. Sean made me feel bad about not making more money, saying he refused to be Captain Save-A-Ho. When I was 19, I was working at the bank during the day and a restaurant at night, and thankfully I was pretty, so I made decent tips. One day I started throwing up blood at work and they were reluctant to go to the hospital. They said I had a tumor the size of a golf ball and I would need to see a specialist. 4 different diagnoses on what they thought it was, but the final one was ovarian cancer. That seemed pretty unheard of at 19, but in my head, I figured it must be been all the medication. My mom had me on when I was prepubescent. That small-town doctor later had his license revoked for illegally selling painkillers, and I've been unable to get my records, but I still feel suspicious if that was an accurate diagnosis or not. I had a really hard time working and going through my treatments, but I stuck it out because I felt like I lost my job. I had a really hard time working and going through my treatments, but I stuck it out because I felt like I lost my job. I would also lose my insurance. That was super tough on me. It was also pretty hard on the relationship, and we would pretty regularly get into fist fights. Once during a fight, Sean body slammed me into a swamp cooler and I fractured my back. I only took off a single day of work, but I was really angry that that's all I could do. 4 months after I was in remission, we got pregnant with my son. For most of my pregnancy they told me I was going to lose him and I should abort, because of the radiation. In the beginning they wanted me on bed rest because the placenta could detach with so much fluid. I was creating too much. About a month after I found out I was pregnant, I got a call from a police officer in Colorado. She said that she regularly visited my mom and my sister for domestic disturbances, and it was so out of hand that foster care might be the only option for my sister unless I was willing to take her. The only thing is I had to wait 4 more weeks until I turned to 21 for them to legally hand her over to me. So I drove to New Mexico, and on my 21st birthday I signed custody papers for my sister. She was a nightmare and stole constantly. Her and Sean were constantly fighting. Then 2 weeks before my son was born, Sean got laid off from his manufacturing job for a government contractor. This was during the 2009 recession. It would be over 2 years before he would have any resemblance of a job again. Every day I would come home to screaming matches between him and my sister. I'd often have to de-escalate it, and he would be so angry at me because he felt like I was picking her side, but in my eyes, she was the kid and he had a higher standard of responsibility. Despite being a small town, people would visit me at the bank every day and offer to put him to work. He said all of those jobs were N-word work and he was better than them. As soon as my son was born, he insisted we have a joint bank accounts because we were a family now. He pretty much spent 15 to 16 hours a day playing video games and got really into porn. He was hostile and I always felt guilty with my sister and my son home with him all day, but I was barely keeping us afloat and there weren't really any child care options. My sister got pregnant at 17 and wanted to put the baby up for adoption. She said the father was a local white kid she went to school with. I met with her family and the adoptive family from Albuquerque. They were so grateful to my sister. They kept buying her stuff, but I warned them that. Ma, she said the father was a local white kid she went to school with. I met with her family and the adoptive family from Albuquerque. They were so grateful to my sister. They kept buying her stuff, but I warned them that maybe they should slow down as she has a tendency to use people. My sister had ditched so much school in Colorado that I had to pay for after-school classes so she could catch up. It was expensive and really hard to get her to go to those classes, but I was so proud that I got her to graduate. Once her baby was born, the baby was dark-complected, and the father refused to sign paternity paperwork that was required for the adoption. The adoptive family had to give the baby back what was supposed to be temporarily while we sorted out a DNA test. They were devastated. My sister was working at a restaurant and when they heard that she last minute got her baby back, they all pitched in with $1,500 so she could buy whatever she needed. To express how much that was at the time, our rent was $650 for 3-bedroom house and most people made under $10 an hour in that town. It was at that moment she decided to keep her son. We regularly fought over her lack of care and attentiveness to her son. he would get rashes, and so she stopped, letting me watch him for her. When she turned 18 they moved out. The very next day I got a call from the hospital and they asked me if I had heard from her. She had brought him in the night before, and he was in intensive care for severe dehydration and rashes. They told her she could go home to take a shower, but she never came back. She hadn't even moved out 24 hours at this point. I went to her house where I found her laying on the floor with a boy. We got a huge fight over it and she stopped talking to me for a while. Sean said that he wanted to pursue a tech career, but that wasn't really possible in our small town, so I transferred my bank to Austin, Texas. Really just hoping he would get a job. A year and a half later he still didn't have a job. I told him every day that I hated him and I didn't want to be with him, but we were on the lease together and I didn't know how to get him off. I made $14 an hour, but didn't qualify for any assistance. We regularly lived off ramen and canned vegetables and I often skipped meals. We were so broke and I felt trapped because I couldn't afford daycare and the expenses myself. I got into apartments and pretty instantly got promoted to assistant manager, and a 20% rent discount. I told him I was for sure leaving, but then he got a job and had my son tell me that he didn't want to live without his father in his life. The job he got was $10 an hour, but it was something. I continued to progress in my career and things settled down for a while. We still thought about money and about how often he played his video games. He would only wear expensive shoes and real polos which we couldn't really afford. I got promoted to an apartment manager and things got a lot better. I could afford to pay a cleaning service once a week and that drastically improved things. On the weekends, he would play video games, but I would take my son on outings and I was at a point where life felt manageable. I started online college. We were getting a lot of pressure to have another child and finally decided to have my daughter. When my daughter was born, Sean got really insistent that we get married because he didn't want to look like the kind of man to have children and not have a proper family. We had a courthouse wedding and I cried the whole way to the courthouse. We never took vows. We weren't even sleeping in the same room at the time because he didn't want the baby to disrupt his sleep. Then when our daughter was 6 weeks old, Sean quit his job. This time he would not stay home with the baby, so we put her in daycare. He made up this lie about a night job that he had for a tech company and I had to tell everybody this as to not embarrass him for his unemployment. He also got very into politics. This was when Trump and Hillary were fighting for the presidency. He would listen to all the extreme YouTube channels all day long and play video games. I was working 15-hour days, but thankfully, I lived at the same property so I could come home and nurse and change diapers every 2 hours or so after he picked the kids up from daycare. I'm assuming because he was unemployed he was feeling bad about himself because he became intolerable. He criticized everything, even what direction I scrubbed the toilet bowl. On top of that he was filthy. I was so overwhelmed that one day when I got home from work at 11, my son asked me what I was gonna make for dinner. I had already prepped dinner that all he had to do was put in the oven. As I was trying to sort through the trashed kitchen to feed him at 11 o'clock at night, Sean stood there in his boxers, fighting for my attention to tell me that I wouldn't believe what these fucking liberals expect us to pay for now with their bullshit welfare programs. That's when I told him I wanted a divorce. He didn't think I was serious at first, but I was. Our lease was up in a month and a half and I told him he wouldn't be on the next one. One day I came home and no one was home. There was an article up on the computer written by a woman who said her husband murdered both of her children and himself in the woods after she told him she wanted a divorce. There was also a rifle on the countertop and the handgun was missing. Immediately started panicking, but then he walked in the house with both kids. He denied leaving the article up, and said I was crazy. We got in a huge fight and he started punching holes in the wall, which was worse because I worked at this community. One of my neighbors called the police, and when I answered the door, he went out the patio and left somewhere. I told the officer we were fine, but I guess he reported this to CPS and they went to interview my son at his school. Nothing came of that, but it was eye-opening for me. I hid all of the guns until after we split, no matter how much of a fit he threw that they were his guns. When we split, I kept everything as non-confrontational as possible. I did job applications for him and even the pre-employment tests. I found him an apartment, one of my friends managed it, and agreed to waive the deposit as a favor to me. He seemed happy as long as he felt like he was going to be okay. Got the job at $28 an hour. The studio was $900 a month in a nice part of town. I hid all of the guns until after we split, no matter how much of a fit he threw that they were his guns. I gave him whatever furniture he wanted and we use our tax return to pay off his car. I gave him all of the money in the account but $65. It was only like $400. I left to go stay with my aunt in Colorado that I had reconnected with only a few years prior. Honestly, the story gets pretty uneventful from this point on. I found a decent job making $70K a year but still struggled as a single mom because the most affordable daycare I could find for my daughter was $1,500 a month plus my son at $200 a week. Our rent was also $1,500 even with my discount. I got really behind on my bills because my checks were only $1,700 after taxes and insurance. I got divorced and my ex-husband has never paid child support except for one period of time, but it only lasted about 4 months. I struggled a lot because my job wanted me to travel, but it wasn't possible with 2 small kids and I was tapped out for daycare. I eventually decided to go self-employed and that has been better, but I'm still struggling. My daughter got mad at me today because all of her friends have a dad and grandparents that love them. We don't get to do vacations, we live in a small duplex and we don't have a lot of stuff. My company I started has been really successful by some standards. I have 1.3 million revenue in just over 2 years. But my pay from that was $105K last year. Which is still good, we eat well, our rent is paid on time but I work constantly and I don't really have a lot to show for it. We live in Denver, we rent, I could never afford a mortgage or down payment. Our place is under 1,000 feet superscript 2 and I feel frustrated because in my head 6 figures should equal a comfortable life, but I still make budget meals. I still can't afford after-school programs or sports and I'm always struggling with cash flow. Mostly I just feel frustrated that I overcame so much and still have made no progress in life. I'm tired and I'm doing my best but it just never seems like enough. People think that because I own a construction company, I should be doing so well. My son is 15, and the best kid but he's almost an adult now, and I was never able to give him any of the things in life that he deserves and that is probably the thing that eats me up the most. I'm just mad that life is like this. Thanks for listening.